Hello again, welcome back to IndyCar on the 15th of November. It's been a curious day news-wise. In fact, there was more news available to me today to talk about than I've actually got time to deliver. So I'm going to keep it to the most essential things possible. Now, first of all, I'd like to quote Peter Bell, because Peter Bell wrote in his blog today concerning a new amendment which the Alba party in Westminster have tabled to the existing devolution settlement. Now, it appears, although I haven't read this particular amendment personally, that Alba is proposing an amendment to an existing act, the act which actually underpins Scottish devolution, in an effort to make it permanent. In other words, so that all of the devolved powers that the Scottish Parliament currently has become permanent. Now, probably use inverted commas when we talk about permanent, but as Peter Bell points out correctly, it doesn't matter whether the powers devolved are permanent or otherwise. It isn't always within the power of the United Kingdom Crown. In other words, King Charles and his Tory government, to just simply take those powers away. No matter how permanent they are on paper, they could simply abolish devolution tomorrow. And even if the powers were permanent, by abolishing or repealing the acts, the whole thing would collapse. And so you have to wonder really why Alba has chosen this particular route to go. Why have they decided to table an amendment which is so obviously never going to work? Because, you know, power devolved is power retained by Westminster. It's not given permanently. It can't be. It's an allowance, if you like, and an allowance which has, I think, been completely mischaracterised to the Scottish people. You've probably heard, especially during the 2014 referendum, the phrase that Scotland has the most powerful devolved administration or government anywhere on the planet. And this was bandied around without any real sort of proof that it was true, particularly, and also the fact that there are very, very few devolved governments in the world anyway, probably just one or two. And so for Scotland to have the most powerful one is not really exactly a huge claim to fame anyway, even if it were true. But it isn't true. And interestingly, the man who has confirmed that it isn't true is the former Labour MP, George Robertson. Now, George Robertson is a Scottish, or was a Scottish MP, and it was his Labour Party which ushered in the current legislation, the Scotland Act of 1998, which created the devolved administration that we have at the moment. But he said, in answer to questions in the committee, that the devolved administration of Scotland is basically the same powers that the Scotland Office had before the Scottish Parliament was actually created. But what's interesting about it is that it isn't the most powerful devolved administration in the world at all. In fact, believe it or not, Northern Ireland has a more powerful administration than Scotland. It has more powers over taxation, it has more powers over things like nuclear weapons, and many other things that Scotland doesn't have. And interestingly, Northern Ireland has the right to a referendum every 7 years on the future of Northern Ireland remaining in the UK, something which Scotland does not have, even though Northern Ireland isn't a country. In fact, it's only 6 counties of somebody else's country, and yet it has more power than the Scottish Parliament, and George Robertson has now confirmed that. So we know that this was a complete lie. Not only was it a complete lie, it's a provable lie, proved by one of the very people who was claiming it was true. So this is an interesting little fact which most of us, I think, had just accepted at face value, that according to the United Kingdom's sloganeering, the Scottish Parliament was the most powerful devolved administration on the planet. What a load of nonsense that is. So imagine the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which have less than 10% of the population of Scotland, have more powers in their little assembly than the entire Scottish edifice of Holyrood. So anything that is done at the moment in the name of Scotland at Holyrood is not as powerful as anything being done, for example, at Stormont in Northern Ireland, if anything ever is done there again. And that's questionable, since the Democratic Unionist Party refused to go into shared administration with Sinn Féin, even though Sinn Féin have the perfect right to that. So the British state says one thing, does another, tries to convince us one thing is true when it knows absolutely for a fact that it's not true. So the Scottish Parliament has been shown to be less powerful than the Northern Ireland Assembly by one of its own architects, George Robertson. And frankly, this doesn't surprise me in any way at all. Okay, other writers have also been evident in their activities today, and notably Wee Ginger Doug. Paul Kavanagh-Mawson was writing today in his normal column. And interestingly, he agreed with my assessment from yesterday about what is likely to happen as a result of Sunak's reshuffle, including David Cameron. So David Cameron, according to Wee Ginger Doug, and I'll paraphrase here, is really a dead cat story. He was there to distract the attention of the ravening media away from Suella Braverman's departure and her bitter, rancorous letter accusing Sunak of basically betraying her trust. So this was a deflection tactic. So Dave Cameron, you may or may not know, but at the time he's the man who's responsible for the damage of Brexit, because he thought that by giving a referendum he would finally get the far-right nutjobs in the Tory party off his back, and he was proved completely wrong, and then he ran away from the consequences of Brexit and wasn't seen again. And then he popped up a few weeks ago where he was asked, how he was feeling about being out in the wilderness, and he said he was bored and he wouldn't mind a crack at the Foreign Office. This is something which was reported as well yesterday and this morning by Dave McGuinness in his Indie Truck Davy broadcast. So Cameron had already intimated to Sunak that he wanted the job as Foreign Secretary. Sunak has made it happen for him. And remember, Sunak, when he was Chancellor, was responsible for making sure that David Cameron's company, Greensill Finance, which was basically collapsing under the weight of debts, got a £5 billion bung from us, the taxpayer, to prop up Cameron's finance company. And now he's got Cameron back into government as the Foreign Secretary, deflecting attention from Suella Braverman, who I said yesterday I believed was setting herself up as the new far-right future leader of the Tory party. And it's interesting that Paul agrees with my assessment on that. He seems to think the same thing, that Sunak is going to lead the Tories to an inglorious defeat next year, followed by presumably the Tories coming back to power with the far-right extremist nutjobs such as Suella Braverman at the helm. Now, he makes an interesting point, which, to be honest with you, I had overlooked until recently, and that is, as you may know from today's newspapers, the UK's so-called Supreme Court, in other words, the English Supreme Court, has told Suella Braverman that her plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda is in fact completely illegal in the UK. It's never going to happen. Something which everybody really thought was so obvious, because Rwanda has a terrible record on human rights, and particularly with asylum seekers and immigration. So for Suella Braverman to basically dump anyone who has come across the channel in a boat on a plane to Rwanda is just not going to happen. But if Braverman does make a return and becomes the Tory PM after Sunak's inglorious defeat next year to the grey man of politics, Keir Starmer, then she is going to insist that the United Kingdom withdraws from the International Convention on Human Rights, which incidentally the United Kingdom was instrumental in setting up in the first place. So the UK, having created an international law on human rights, which everybody would abide by and sign up to, if Braverman comes back as the PM, will leave that Convention on Human Rights. And as Paul Kavanagh-Mawson pointed out, there is the potential in that once the Human Rights Act in the United Kingdom has been torn up and ceremonially burned, of the return of things like capital punishment by the far-right frothers of the extreme Tory party right wing. The kind of people who believe in, flogging and hanging and all that sort of thing. So hanging could be brought back under an extreme far-right Tory government. But not only that, but it's going to justify Suella Braverman in tent stealing from people who had nothing, taking what little possessions they have left and leaving them destitute and shelterless on the streets. Seems to be what is the future for the United Kingdom. So it's going to become an intolerant, far-right extremist dictatorship where anybody coming here without the necessary papers will basically be cast into the gutter and have all their possessions removed. And if they can get them on a plane to some dangerous foreign dictatorship in Africa somewhere, they'll do it. So the outlook for the United Kingdom is pretty bloody awful. If the Labour Party wins, and I'm saying wins next year in inverted commas, it's going to be the wooden spoon for the Labour Party. They're going to have to try and put the United Kingdom back together after the Tories have completely ruined it. And then when they fail to do that and Keir Starmer can't actually put Humpty Dumpty back together again, Braverman is going to come riding over the horizon, waving this international Convention on Human Rights and tearing it up in front of everybody and saying we're withdrawing from that, we're going to pull up the drawbridge and fill the moat, and nobody's getting into the UK, and everybody who comes in illegally will literally be dispossessed and cast onto the streets. It's not an attractive proposition. If you happen to live in Scotland and you're thinking about whether it's a good idea to stay within this alleged union of so-called equals, which is supposedly voluntary, it doesn't look terribly great, does it? I mean, the idea of Suella Braverman as the Prime Minister and Scotland going along with this far-right racist crap, it just doesn't sit well with me. I don't know about you. However, it's interesting that virtually all of the political commentators who I normally read agree that this is the case, that Britain is going to hell in a handcart. It's lurching as far to the right as it's possible to go. Keir Starmer has been characterised as being to the right of Margaret Thatcher. Now that is a very interesting description for a so-called Labour leader. And he's also surrounded himself with cretins and imbeciles who obviously no threat to his position. Basically, yes men and yes women who will just do what he says. The Labour Party has put out a statement calling for extended periods of ceasefire for humanitarian reasons in Gaza in an effort to try and quell the riots that are going on within the Labour Party at the moment amongst its membership, who are crying for a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, to happen. And of course Starmer's never going to say that because it wouldn't appeal to the far-right voters of the southeast of England, who he's trying to appeal to in order to win the next general election. The whole thing smacks of Tony Blair, but on steroids. And I see, not only, as I said yesterday, I was talking about how it reminded me of John Major's tenure as Prime Minister, when he basically saw the Tory party out the door of 10 Downing Street. Now we've got Sunak performing the same function and awaiting a new far-right leader for the Tory party to jump into his place after Starmer fails to put the country back together again. I don't see any brilliant future in this so-called union of equals, do you? And frankly, I think it's high time that our own politicians, and I would include Alba politicians in this, stop making futile efforts to change laws in Westminster, which they know cannot change anything anyway, just in order to be seen to be doing something which is a bit different from what the SNP is not doing in Westminster. Either way, the politicians at the moment are a complete mess. They're a useless bunch, every single one of them, from every single party, fighting amongst themselves like rats in a sack. And the rest of us wondering who the hell to vote for in the next general election and what actual what the actual point of voting in the next general election might be, when it's so bloody obvious that no matter what happens in the next general election, if we get Starmer, well, we get more right-wing politics. If we get Suella Braverman, then we get even more right-wing politics than that. None of which is going to sit well with the vast majority of Scottish people who have to put up with this nonsense. And now that we know that we don't have the most powerful devolved administration in the world at all, and that tiny little Northern Ireland with its 6 counties and its just over 500,000 inhabitants is actually more powerful than the Holyrood Parliament, well, that just kind of puts you in your place and just sets things in context nicely. We don't matter. Our politicians in Westminster are there to be laughed at and mocked, because that seems to be their major purpose down there. And voting for anybody in Scotland of any party at the moment doesn't look like it's going to make a great deal of difference to anything. So unless one of the parties of independence decides to grow a spine and say, we're not going to do this anymore, I can't see very much changing in the next 12 months. I hope I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong. I would absolutely love it if the SNP came out of the starting blocks and said, we're going for independence. Not only that, but if we win this next general election on seat count, we're going to empower the Holyrood Parliament to hold that referendum and give everybody the choice that everyone has been waiting for the last 10 years or more. But will it happen? Who knows? I mean, today's other news is filled with weird stories as well. Just to let you know a couple of weird things that happened this morning. There is a rumour, it is only a rumour at the moment, that somewhere in Shettleston, the local authorities or the emergency services have shut down an area of Shettleston because of a biological hazard of some kind in somebody's house. Which sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? And speaking of biological hazards, I also know from bitter experience this morning that all driving tests at the driving test centre at Annisland are off today because the test centre has been flooded with raw sewage. Always puzzled me, that word, raw sewage. It's as if there's some kind of cooked sewage, which is more acceptable. But anyway, those are the other two little minor stories that happened today. Anyway, that's it from IndyCar today. I hope you find today's exercise in examining the futility of political life in the UK at the moment interesting. And as usual, make your comments in the normal way. Also, please keep donating so I can make more programmes like this, and hopefully with something a bit more positive to report in the next few days. That's it from IndyCar today. Keep the faith, but remember that there is still a majority of people in Scotland who are sane and know that it's not a good idea to stay in the UK no matter who's in charge after next year's general election. Bye for now.